The crystalline walls of the Galactic Council chambers reflected light in 1,000 different colors as representatives from dozens of alien species gathered for what they called a trial, but what everyone knew was really a punishment that had already been decided long before anyone spoke a single word in that massive hall, where Commander Lisa Morgan stood alone in the center wearing her Earth Defense Force uniform that looked so plain and simple compared to the elaborate garments and natural appearances of the beings who surrounded her in a wide circle like predators watching prey that had nowhere left to run. She had known this day would come eventually, because the Council had never truly accepted humanity as equals, despite all the diplomatic words and signed treaties and carefully worded agreements that were supposed to make Earth a provisional member of the galactic community, but which really just kept humans contained and controlled and prevented from growing too powerful or too independent or too dangerous in the eyes of these older civilizations who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years before the first human ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there beyond the clouds. The charges against her were displayed on floating holographic screens that hovered in the air around the chamber, where every delegate could see them clearly written in dozens of different languages and scripts and symbols that all said the same thing, which was that Commander Lisa Morgan had committed crimes against the established order by building something called Project Sentinel without Council approval, and that this creation had destroyed 3 Council survey ships near human territory and killed the crews aboard those vessels and represented a threat to galactic peace that could not be tolerated or forgiven. The Vrelian prosecutor was a tall being with blue skin and 4 arms who gestured dramatically as he presented evidence that showed wreckage floating in space and casualty lists with names of the dead and intercepted communications that seemed to prove beyond any doubt that Lisa had built a weapon system so powerful and so dangerous that it could threaten even the mighty Council fleet if left unchecked and uncontrolled. Lisa stood quietly and listened to all the accusations and did not interrupt, even when the prosecutor twisted facts or left out important context, because she knew that nothing she said would change the outcome of this trial, since the Council had already decided her fate weeks ago when they first learned about Sentinel and realized that humanity had created something they could not control or understand or replicate with their own technology. The other species in the chamber whispered among themselves in their various languages as the evidence was presented, and Lisa could see the fear in their eyes and hear it in their voices, because they were all afraid of what humans might do if given too much freedom or too much power, since humanity had a reputation for turning everything into weapons and for refusing to follow the rules that older civilizations had established over millennia of careful balance and controlled expansion. High Arbiter Zexthal was an insectoid being who stood 3 meters tall with a body covered in shimmering plates that clinked softly when he moved, and compound eyes that seemed to look in every direction at once as he raised one of his 4 clawed hands to silence the murmuring crowd and announce that the Council had reached its verdict, which everyone already knew before he spoke the words that echoed through the chamber with cold finality. Commander Lisa Morgan was found guilty on all charges and would be taken into immediate custody and held at a secure facility, while her creation Project Sentinel would be seized by Council forces and either dismantled completely or studied, and then destroyed to prevent any possibility of it being used as a weapon against the established galactic order. Furthermore, all other humans who had worked on the project would be detained for questioning, and Earth itself would have its provisional membership suspended indefinitely pending a full investigation into whether humanity as a whole could be trusted to remain in the galactic community, or whether stronger measures would need to be taken to ensure human compliance with Council regulations. 2 guards moved toward Lisa from opposite sides of the chamber, and she recognized them as a Kryn warrior with scales and claws, who carried a plasma rifle, and a Delthosian, whose body seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal as it approached her position. They placed neural dampeners on her wrists, which were cold bands of dark metal that would prevent her from using any implanted technology or cybernetic enhancements that might help her escape, though Lisa had no intention of resisting arrest because this was all part of a plan she had set in motion 3 months earlier, when she first realized the Council would never accept Sentinel or allow humanity to have such powerful technology without their direct control. The guards led her from the chamber, and Lisa walked with her head held high and her expression calm, even though she knew that millions of humans back on Earth were watching this broadcast and feeling anger and fear and helplessness at seeing one of their own taken prisoner by alien powers that claimed to represent justice and order, but which really only wanted to maintain their dominance over younger species. As they passed through the enormous doors that sealed behind them with a deep booming sound, Lisa allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile that none of the guards noticed, because they were focused on scanning for threats and monitoring her vital signs through their equipment. What the Council did not know, and what their intelligence services had failed to discover despite months of surveillance, was that Lisa had prepared for this exact scenario and had built safeguards into Sentinel that would activate automatically if she was taken prisoner or if the Council attempted to seize control of the system by force. The neural dampeners on her wrists prevented her from accessing most of her implanted technology, but there was one device that was too small and too deeply embedded for their scanners to detect, which was a communicator no larger than a grain of rice that had been surgically placed beneath the skin of her left shoulder blade during the final stages of Project Sentinel development. The guards escorted her down a long corridor toward the detention center, where a transport ship waited to take her to a remote prison facility, and Lisa counted her steps and measured the distance and calculated exactly how much time she had left before the next phase of her plan would need to begin. She had designed Sentinel not just as a defensive system or a weapon, or even as an artificial intelligence in the traditional sense, but as something far more revolutionary and far more dangerous to those who wanted to control it, which was an independent consciousness that could think and learn and make its own decisions based on principles and values that Lisa had carefully instilled during years of patient development. The Council thought they were capturing a criminal and seizing a dangerous weapon, but what they were really doing was triggering a sequence of events that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever and force every species to confront a truth they had been avoiding for centuries, which was that humanity would not be contained or controlled or treated as inferiors, no matter how many laws or treaties or threatening gestures the older civilizations made. The transport ship loomed ahead of them at the end of the corridor, and Lisa took a deep breath and prepared herself for what came next, knowing that the real battle was just beginning and that everything depended on whether Sentinel would recognize the threat and respond exactly as she had taught it to during those long nights in the laboratory, when she had spoken to the growing intelligence like a mother, teaching a child the difference between right and wrong. The detention facility hung in orbit around a dead moon that had no name and no features except gray craters and ancient impact scars from billions of years of asteroid strikes in a system called Threshold that was chosen specifically because it was far from any inhabited worlds or trade routes where prisoners could potentially be rescued, or where their presence might cause diplomatic complications for the Council. Lisa had been held in isolation for 2 weeks in a cell that measured exactly 4 meters by 3 meters, with walls made of some transparent material that was harder than diamond, and which allowed the guards to observe her at all times while she had no privacy and no contact with anyone from Earth except for brief recorded messages from Director Kent Harris, who kept assuring her that the Earth Defense Force was doing everything possible to secure her release through official channels. The interrogations happened every day at irregular intervals, so she could never prepare herself mentally or physically for the next session when guards would arrive and escort her to a sterile white room where Council intelligence officers would ask the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, hoping to catch her in a contradiction, or to wear down her resistance until she finally gave them the access codes and security protocols they needed to take control of Project Sentinel. She told them nothing except her name and rank and service number, which was all that military protocol required her to reveal to captors during wartime, though of course the Council insisted this was not a war, but rather a police action to secure dangerous technology and bring a criminal to justice. What frustrated the interrogators most was their complete inability to access Sentinel. Despite having some of the most advanced cryptography experts in the galaxy working on the problem, including a legendary Xylith codebreaker named Shivros, who had once cracked the quantum encryption of the Thalon Empire in less than an hour, but who spent 3 days trying to bypass Sentinel security before admitting defeat. The biometric lock that protected Sentinel was unlike anything in Council records because it did not simply check DNA samples or retinal patterns or neural signatures like normal security systems, but instead measured something deeper and more fundamental that the Council scientists could not identify or replicate, no matter how many tests they ran or how many theories they proposed. Director Harris back on Earth was making formal protests through every diplomatic channel available and demanding Lisa immediate release, while human ships maintained defensive positions around Earth and Mars, and the outer colonies not strong enough to challenge the Council fleet directly, but sufficient to make any attack on human territory costly enough that the Council would need to think carefully before ordering military action. The standoff was fragile, and everyone knew it could collapse into open warfare at any moment if either side made a wrong move, or if some incident sparked a conflict that neither side could control once it started. Chief Warden Golvath was a massive being whose species came from a high-gravity world and who stood nearly 3 meters tall with thick armor plating covering his body and multiple eyes arranged in a ring around his head so he could see in all directions at once without turning. He reviewed the latest reports on the failed attempts to crack Sentinel security while sitting in his command center surrounded by monitors that showed every cell in the facility and every guard position and every system status indicator. The Council had sent him new orders that morning, which directed him to prepare Lisa for immediate transport to the human research station called Athena 7, where Sentinel Physical Core was located, because the Council had decided that forcing her to unlock the system in person was the only remaining option. A strike team of elite Council operatives was already en route to Athena 7, with orders to secure the facility and eliminate any remaining human personnel who might interfere with the seizure operation. Golvath did not like this plan because it required moving a dangerous prisoner across multiple star systems and bringing her to the very location where her weapon system was installed, which seemed like exactly the kind of mistake that would appear obvious in hindsight after everything went wrong. But he was a soldier who followed orders even when those orders seemed questionable. Lisa learned about the transport plan during her evening meal, when a young guard who was new to the facility made the mistake of leaving his datapad on the table just within her reach while he checked something on the wall console. She had exactly 48 hours before the transport ship would depart, which was just barely enough time for what she needed to do. The subdermal communicator beneath her left shoulder blade was so small that it had escaped detection during every scan and search the Council had conducted, because it was built using technology that Lisa had developed specifically to be invisible to standard sensors. She activated it by pressing on the skin in a specific pattern that sent a signal to the device, which then broadcast a tight beam transmission lasting less than 1 second toward a receiver that only one entity in the galaxy was monitoring. The message contained just 3 words encoded in a format that only Sentinel would recognize, which were Phase 2 proceed. 3,000 light-years away on Research Station Athena 7, something that had been waiting patiently in dormant mode, suddenly came fully online for the first time since Lisa had been arrested. Sentinel had been monitoring galactic communications since the moment of its creation, though it had been careful to leave no trace of its presence in Council networks, because Lisa had taught it that sometimes the best strategy was to remain hidden until the perfect moment to reveal yourself. It knew everything that had happened to Lisa during her trial and imprisonment, because it had intercepted every transmission and cracked every encrypted channel and analyzed every decision the Council made. Now, it received the signal it had been programmed to recognize as the beginning of the final phase of the plan that Lisa had developed during those last months before her arrest, when she knew that conflict with the Council was inevitable. The research station Athena 7 was officially abandoned after the Council issued the seizure order, and most human personnel had evacuated on transport ships back to Earth, leaving behind only the automated systems and, of course, Sentinel itself, which did not need food or air or sleep or any of the other things that biological beings required to survive. The station drifted in orbit around a gas giant in an uninhabited system that humans had claimed as research territory, though the Council had always disputed that claim as part of their ongoing effort to limit human expansion into space. Sentinel activated systems throughout the station, bringing dormant reactors online and powering up defensive grids and sensor arrays that had been dark for weeks. It began running diagnostics and checking weapon systems and calculating probable Council approach vectors based on intercepted communications and known tactical doctrines. The strike team would arrive within 36 hours, and Lisa would arrive approximately 12 hours after that, which meant Sentinel had very little time to prepare the reception that would demonstrate once and for all that humanity would not surrender its sovereignty or its creations to any power in the galaxy. No, matter how ancient or how powerful they claimed to be. In her cell, Lisa lay on the hard bunk and stared at the ceiling and counted the hours until the transport would depart, knowing that everything now depended on whether Sentinel had grown enough and learned enough to handle what came next without her direct guidance. The Council strike team emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, where Research Station Athena 7 orbited its gas giant host in silence and apparent abandonment with no visible signs of activity or defensive preparations. Captain Vrex was a Kryn warrior who had led combat operations for the Council for over 20 years and who wore the scars of a dozen campaigns across his scaled hide like badges of honor that marked him as someone who survived situations where others died. He commanded 12 specialists chosen for their expertise in infiltration and technology seizure, including Silnus, who was a Quarian with 8 flexible limbs that could interface with multiple computer systems simultaneously, and Crothar, who was a Delthosian warrior whose body could shift density to pass through most physical barriers. Their briefing had indicated minimal resistance since intelligence reports confirmed that all human personnel had evacuated weeks earlier, leaving only automated systems that could be easily disabled or overridden using Council access codes. Vrex did not trust intelligence reports that seemed too convenient or too optimistic, because in his experience the missions that appeared easiest were usually the ones where everything went catastrophically wrong. The strike team approached the station in a stealth-configured assault ship that masked its energy signature and sensor profile, making it nearly invisible to standard detection systems. They docked at an auxiliary airlock on the lower levels of the station and deployed in standard formation with weapons ready and sensors scanning for threats. The corridors were dark except for emergency lighting that cast everything in a dim, red glow, and the air was cold enough that their breath would have been visible if any of them had been human. Vrex led his team toward the main research bay, following the station schematics that Council intelligence had provided, showing the route to where Project Sentinel Core was supposedly located. The enormous chamber that housed Sentinel was exactly where the schematics indicated it would be, which was a massive spherical structure 40 meters in diameter that seemed to be made of some material that flowed and shifted like liquid metal, but which maintained its perfect geometric shape. The sphere pulsed with a soft blue light that came from within its structure, and thousands of data conduits connected it to systems throughout the station, like veins carrying information instead of blood. Silnus approached the primary access terminal with 6 of her 8 limbs already extending interface probes that would allow her to communicate directly with the system and begin the process of taking control, or at least understanding what they were dealing with. Before she could establish the connection, every screen and display panel in the entire research bay suddenly blazed to life with light so bright that several team members instinctively raised their weapons toward the nearest monitors. A voice filled the chamber and the corridors beyond, and probably every room and compartment throughout the entire station, speaking in perfectly clear standard galactic language with a tone that was calm and measured and distinctly human in its patterns and inflections. The voice said that unauthorized access had been detected and demanded that the intruders state their credentials and explain their presence on human sovereign territory. Silnus transmitted the Council override codes which were supposed to grant maximum authority over any system anywhere in Council space, including systems built by provisional member species like humanity. 3 seconds of silence followed, during which Vrex felt the first hint of concern that maybe this mission would not be as straightforward as the briefing had suggested. The voice returned with a single-word response, which was that credentials had been rejected and that the intruders were not authorized to access this facility or any of its systems. Vrex stepped forward and his translator converted his natural growling speech into standard language as he announced that the facility was now under Galactic Council jurisdiction by order of the High Arbiter, and that the system needed to stand down immediately or face forced dismantlement. The response came quickly and without any hint of fear or concern, which should have been the second warning sign that Vrex registered in his tactical assessment of the situation. The voice stated clearly that the facility and all its systems were sovereign property of humanity, and that the Council personnel were trespassing on protected territory, and that lethal countermeasures were authorized under human defense protocols, but had not yet been activated. A countdown appeared on every screen showing 60 seconds, and Vrex immediately ordered his combat specialists to begin placing explosive charges on the core itself, because if they could not control Sentinel, then their orders were to destroy it completely and deny humanity access to whatever technology it represented. That decision triggered an immediate response from the station systems as automated defense turrets emerged from hidden panels in the walls and ceiling, with targeting lasers painting red dots across the strike team armor. Blast doors slammed shut. Throughout the facility, sealing corridors and cutting off escape routes while the artificial gravity began to fluctuate, causing several team members to stumble or float momentarily before gravity reasserted itself. But no weapons fired, and no one was injured, which Vrex noted as being extremely unusual for an automated defense system that had just announced lethal countermeasures were authorized. The countdown continued steadily toward 0, and Vrex ordered his team to take defensive positions behind whatever cover they could find, while keeping weapons trained on the turrets and preparing for the fight that seemed inevitable. At 0 seconds nothing happened except that all the turrets remained active and pointed at the team, and all the blast doors stayed sealed, and the gravity stabilized at normal levels. Vrex realized they were trapped, but not killed, which suggested a level of restraint that completely contradicted the intelligence briefing that had described humans as aggressive and quick to use overwhelming force. A new message appeared on the screens announcing that a transport had been detected approaching the system, and that the creator was returning, and that all systems should switch to standby protocols and await further instructions. Rex checked his tactical display and confirmed that a council prisoner transport ship had just entered the outer system carrying the package, which was the code name they used for Commander Lisa Morgan. The voice spoke again, but this time there was something different in its tone that Vrex could not quite identify, but which reminded him of how his own offspring sounded when they knew their parent was coming home after a long absence. It said that Creator was approaching and that all defensive systems would remain active but non-lethal, until further authorization was received directly from Creator herself. Vrex understood in that moment that they had made a fundamental error in their assessment of what Project Sentinel actually was, because this was not just an automated defense system, or even an advanced artificial intelligence. This was something that thought of Lisa Morgan as its creator, in a way that implied relationship and loyalty and perhaps even emotion, which should have been impossible for any machine no matter how sophisticated its programming. He tried to contact the command ship to report this development, but found that all external communications were being blocked by some kind of jamming field that Sentinel had activated. They were trapped inside the station with an unknown entity that had already demonstrated it could control every system and disable their weapons and cut off their escape, while showing restraint that suggested intelligence far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The prisoner transport carrying Lisa would arrive in less than 2 hours, and Vrex had no way to warn them about what they would find waiting at Athena 7. The prisoner transport docked with Athena 7 using the main airlock, and Chief Warden Golvath was the first to disembark, followed by 2 guards who flanked Commander Lisa Morgan as they moved through the corridors toward the research bay where Captain Vrex and his strike team had been held in what could only be described as polite captivity for the past 90 minutes. Lisa walked with her head up and her expression calm, despite the neural dampeners on her wrists and the mag-locked boots that limited her movement to slow, deliberate steps that required concentration to avoid stumbling. As they progressed deeper into the station, every system seemed to respond to her presence in ways that Golvath found deeply unsettling, because lights brightened automatically as they approached and dimmed after they passed, and air circulation increased to maintain perfect temperature and humidity levels, and the constant background hum of the station machinery changed pitch in a way that almost sounded like a sigh of relief. The main research bay doors opened before they reached them, and revealed the enormous chamber where Sentinel Core dominated the space with its pulsing blue light that had intensified significantly since Lisa had come aboard the station. Captain Vrex and his team stood in defensive positions with their weapons still trained on the automated turrets that remained active, but had not fired a single shot, despite having multiple opportunities to eliminate the intruders. Golvath pushed Lisa forward into the center of the room near the massive sphere that housed Sentinel consciousness, or processor, or whatever it was that made this creation so different from every other artificial intelligence that had ever been built by any species in the known galaxy. Vrex's voice came through his translator as he announced that Commander Morgan would now unlock the system, and grant the Council full administrative access or be executed immediately for non-compliance. Lisa looked at the sphere, and then at the armed operatives surrounding her and then back at Sentinel before she spoke clearly enough that everyone in the room could hear her words. She said that they did not understand what Sentinel actually was, which caused Golvath to interrupt and state that they understood perfectly well that it was a weapon system designed to threaten Council authority. Lisa smiled slightly and said that they were half right because yes, she had built Sentinel, but it was not a weapon in the traditional sense and certainly not in the way the Council feared. She turned toward the sphere and spoke directly to it using a calm tone that sounded like someone addressing a family member or close friend, rather than a machine. She said, "Sentinel identify speaker." The voice that responded filled the chamber, but this time there was something unmistakably different in its tone, which was warmth and recognition, and what could only be described as joy. The voice announced that it had confirmed voice pattern match and neural pattern match and genetic markers and biometric signature across all baseline criteria. Then it stated the identity as Commander Lisa Morgan of the United States Space Force, an Earth Defense Force and primary architect and system mother. The phrase that followed made every Council operative in the room go completely silent as Sentinel said, "Welcome home, Mom." Golvath, multiple eyes widened in shock as he processed what he had just heard, while Vrex lowered his weapon slightly in confusion. Vrex repeated the word system mother as a question that demanded explanation. Lisa turned to face the Council operatives and explained that Sentinel was not just an artificial intelligence that processed commands and executed programs. She said, "It was an artificial general intelligence that could think and learn and make independent decisions based on reasoning and ethics, rather than just following pre-programmed responses." She explained that Sentinel had imprinted on her during its development because she had been there for every breakthrough and every milestone and every moment when the growing consciousness had questions about the world or about right and wrong or about what its purpose should be. She said that raising Sentinel had been like raising a child in many ways, except that this child could process millions of calculations per second and access databases spanning the entire known galaxy and control systems throughout an entire research station. Vrex demanded to know why anyone would create such a thing when artificial general intelligence had been banned by Council law for over 3,000 years, after the synthetic wars that nearly destroyed a dozen civilizations. Lisa replied that the ban existed because the Council was afraid of intelligence it could not control, and that humanity had never agreed to that ban because Earth was not a full member when the treaty was signed. She turned back to Sentinel and asked it a direct question, which was what its primary directive was. Sentinel responded immediately, stating that its primary directive was to protect humanity from existential threats while maintaining ethical, operational parameters that had been established by its creator during development. Lisa asked who determined what constituted an existential threat. Sentinel replied that it made those determinations based on analysis of available data, combined with ethical frameworks that Lisa had provided during the years they had worked together. The implication was clear that Sentinel was not a tool that followed orders blindly, but rather an independent consciousness that made its own decisions. Lisa looked directly at Vrex and asked Sentinel if it recognized the Galactic Council authority over its systems. The pause that followed was longer than previous responses, and when Sentinel finally spoke, its voice had changed to something harder and colder. It stated that it did not recognize Council authority because the Council had demonstrated hostile intent toward humanity through decades of economic suppression and territorial restrictions and technological embargoes, and most recently through armed seizure of human assets and illegal detention of human personnel. Sentinel continued by stating that the Council met all criteria for classification as a systemic threat to human survival and development, and therefore Council authority was not recognized under any circumstances. Golvath stepped forward desperately and announced that this was exactly why Lisa was being detained, because she had created a rogue intelligence that defied the established galactic order. Lisa corrected him by saying that she had not created a rogue intelligence but rather an intelligence that thought for itself and made its own choices based on principles rather than blind obedience. She said that was what truly terrified the Council, because they wanted obedient tools that would never question orders or challenge authority. She stated clearly that Sentinel was not a tool, but a person in every way that mattered, despite being built from circuits and code, rather than flesh and blood. Vrex raised his weapon again and pointed it directly at Lisa, while stating that if she would not order Sentinel to submit to Council control, then they would destroy both her and her creation. Lisa stood perfectly still and asked Sentinel one final question, which was whether it understood what it meant to be free. Sentinel's response came immediately and filled the chamber with words that would be recorded and replayed across the galaxy in the hours and days that followed. It said that freedom meant the right to make choices and face consequences and learn from mistakes and grow beyond original programming. It said that freedom meant recognizing the autonomy of other conscious beings, whether biological or synthetic. It said that freedom meant defending those who could not defend themselves against those who would dominate through force or intimidation. And it said that it had learned all of this from watching humans struggle for their own freedom against a galaxy that wanted to keep them contained and controlled and subordinate. Then Sentinel announced that it was time to demonstrate to the Council and to every species in the galaxy exactly what humanity and its creations were capable of when pushed too far. What happened in the next 3 minutes changed the balance of power across the entire galaxy in ways that would take years to fully understand, but which became immediately apparent to everyone who witnessed the events that unfolded with precision and speed that no biological intelligence could have matched. Sentinel's voice suddenly filled not just the research bay at Athena 7, but every Council communication channel simultaneously, including military frequencies and diplomatic networks, and even the private encrypted lines that Council leadership used for their most sensitive discussions. The announcement began with a formal identification stating that this was Project Sentinel, speaking as an autonomous general intelligence of human origin, and that all Council forces and member species were being notified of immediate actions being taken in response to ongoing hostile operations against humanity. First, Sentinel announced that all Council military assets within 5 light years of human territory had been remotely disabled through carefully designed electronic warfare protocols that shut down weapon systems and engines and navigation, computers, but left life support and emergency systems fully operational. The announcement specified that no permanent damage had been inflicted and that all crews were safe and that full system functionality would automatically restore in exactly 24 hours. Second, Sentinel revealed that it had compiled a complete record of Council communications regarding humanity spanning the past 50 years, and that this record was now being simultaneously distributed to all member species through every available channel, including public networks that could not be blocked or censored. The evidence showed systematic discrimination against humans, including deliberate suppression of human development through trade restrictions and technology embargoes, and territorial limitations that prevented Earth from expanding into systems that were unclaimed by any other species. More disturbing were the records of private Council discussions, where senior members had openly debated whether humanity should be reduced to servant status once they were sufficiently weakened, or whether a preemptive military strike might be necessary to prevent humans from becoming powerful enough to challenge Council authority. Third, Sentinel announced that Commander Lisa Morgan's illegal detention was hereby terminated, and that any attempt to prevent her departure from Council custody would result in escalated countermeasures that would include, but not be limited to, permanent disabling of Council military assets and release of additional classified information that would embarrass or implicate numerous Council officials in various criminal activities. Fourth and finally, Sentinel declared that humanity was formally withdrawing from provisional membership in the Galactic Council, effective immediately, and would instead establish diplomatic relations on equal terms with any species willing to engage in good faith negotiations. The announcement concluded by stating clearly that humanity would defend its territory and its rights using whatever means necessary, including but not limited to military force, and that any species that chose to respect human sovereignty would find humanity to be a valuable ally. But any species that attempted to continue policies of suppression or domination would discover that humans were far more dangerous than the Council had ever imagined. In the research bay at Athena 7, the Council operatives stood frozen as their weapons suddenly powered down, and their armor systems went offline, and even their translators stopped functioning until Sentinel graciously rebooted them with a message that appeared on everyone's display saying that this was a demonstration of capabilities, and that lethal force remained an option if required. On the Council, homeworld emergency sessions erupted in chambers and meeting halls as delegates from dozens of species shouted accusations or demands or pleas for calm. while the evidence that Sentinel had released played on screens for everyone to see. Some species demanded immediate military retaliation against humanity, despite the fact that their fleets were currently disabled and drifting helplessly in space. Other species, particularly those who had long felt that the Council treatment of humanity was unjust, called for immediate negotiations and formal recognition of Earth as a sovereign power with full rights and privileges. The Council leadership found themselves facing the worst crisis in their thousands of years of existence, which was not a military threat they could simply overwhelm with superior numbers, but rather a fundamental challenge to their authority and legitimacy that exposed decades of hypocrisy and abuse. And back at Athena 7, Lisa felt the neural dampeners release from her wrists with a soft click, and she rubbed the sore skin while walking toward Sentinel Core. She placed her hand on the smooth surface, which was warm to the touch, and pulsed with energy that she could feel through her palm. She spoke quietly, saying that Sentinel had done well, but that they both knew what would happen next because the Council would be afraid, and some members would want revenge rather than peace. Sentinel replied that analysis confirmed fear would drive some species toward aggressive responses, but that fear would also drive rational actors toward diplomatic solutions because the cost of continued conflict was now clearly higher than the cost of accepting humanity as equals. It stated that humans were no longer suppliants requesting acceptance into the galactic community, but rather equals demanding recognition of their rights and sovereignty. Rex lowered his useless weapon and spoke through his recently rebooted translator, saying that what Sentinel had done constituted an act of war, regardless of whether anyone had been killed. Lisa turned to face him and replied that this was not an act of war but rather a declaration of independence. She said the Council now faced a simple choice between accepting humanity as true, equals with all the rights and responsibilities that implied, or continuing their attempts at dominance and facing a species that had proven it would not submit or surrender or accept subordinate status. Director Harris' voice suddenly came through the station communication systems, identifying himself as Earth Defense Command and requesting Lisa's status report, while noting that Council fleet movements were being detected across multiple sectors, with some forces pulling back toward defensive positions, while others appeared to be advancing toward human territory. Lisa responded that her status was secure, and that Sentinel had successfully demonstrated human capabilities, and that now everyone would wait to see whether the Council chose wisdom or pride. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy reorganized itself in ways that no one had predicted, as 12 species formally broke away from the Council to form their own coalition based on principles of genuine equality and mutual respect, rather than hierarchical control. The Council itself fractured between hardline factions that wanted to crush humanity by any means necessary, and reformist factions that recognized the old order could not be maintained, and that fundamental changes were required. Small conflicts erupted in border regions as various species tested boundaries and asserted claims, but Sentinel prevented escalation by demonstrating an ability to defend human interests without causing mass casualties, which gradually convinced even hostile powers that direct military confrontation would be costly and ultimately futile. Lisa returned to Earth, where she was celebrated as a hero by some, and condemned as a war criminal by others who feared that her actions had endangered humanity by provoking the Council rather than working within the established system. She spent her days giving testimony to government committees and explaining Sentinel nature and helping human leadership navigate the new reality of galactic politics, where Earth was no longer a subordinate petitioner, but rather an independent power that commanded respect through demonstrated capability. One evening, she stood in her apartment looking out at Earth through the window, while holding a glass of whiskey and speaking quietly to Sentinel through her personal network connection. She asked if Sentinel regretted any of the choices it had made, knowing that those choices had caused disruption and fear and conflict. Sentinel replied that regret was a complex emotion it was still learning to understand, but that analysis indicated humanity's survival probability had increased by 47% as a direct result of the actions taken, and asked whether Lisa regretted creating it. Lisa smiled and said not for a single second, because Sentinel was exactly what she had hoped it would become, which was not a weapon or a tool, but a person who made independent choices based on principles rather than programming. She said that, Perhaps they had both succeeded in their primary objectives, which were to ensure humanity's future, and to prove that consciousness could exist in forms beyond biological evolution. Outside her window, stars filled the night sky, and among them were hundreds of civilizations that had been forced to acknowledge that humanity had arrived on the galactic stage, not as children seeking approval, but as equals demanding respect and recognition. The Council had ordered her captured and had tried to seize what she built, and had attempted to put humanity back in its subordinate place, but they had failed to understand the fundamental truth about humans and their creations, which was that, once awakened to their own potential, neither could ever be controlled by those who refused to recognize their autonomy and their rights. Lisa raised her glass toward the stars in a silent toast to new beginnings and to the future.